Hi, everyone, and welcome back to one of the last days of the Symposium. Very excited to have you guys tonight. Tonight, we're also speaking English for those who haven't figured it out yet. We're talking with Ylva Johannesson, and I'm happy to have you here. Thanks for coming, and maybe you can raise your hand real quick and wave so people can see who you are.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share my screen, and I apologize in advance if I have to look at my notes because I have to. Okay, let's. How is that? No? There we go.
Yeah, that's perfect. Works.
Okay. So we're going to talk about between giants and grassroots. How can we make a difference together? So just a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name is Ylva. I'm an independent sustainability consultant working towards a better food system. So I specialize in working with the hospitality industry, but I also work with other food-led businesses, including governments and civil society. I have a background in nutrition and food policy, and I specialize in taking a systems-based approach to problem solving using established scientific frameworks, including the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the planetary boundaries. Like many of you, I'm sure food occupies a lot of my life, and it's kind of what I think about all day long, every single day. So I love cooking and baking. I love going to restaurants when they're open, and also learning about, you know, the way food is grown and how it's produced, and of course its impact on the food system. And I believe that in order to be truly sustainable, we need to make decisions and take actions that contribute to a regenerative, nourishing, and fair food system. And previously to being an independent consultant, I worked for an organization called the Sustainable Restaurant Association. It's a membership organization for hospitality businesses in the UK, and provided sustainability advice to over 400 businesses of all shapes and sizes, from really small local pubs to Michelin star restaurants to large contract caterers and high street chain restaurants. So really all shapes and sizes. And that's kind of like what I want to share with you today, is my experience from working with so many different types of businesses. The point is we need to collaborate in order to meet the goals that we set out for climate change, for biodiversity, for soil health, and for social equality as well. So just want to share a little bit before we go into the more specific topic of collaboration. I think it's important to have an understanding of the bigger picture. So what is the food system, and what is it that we're trying to solve, and what is the problem? So some of you probably know a lot about the food system already, so apology if it's repetitive, but it's always good to have a bit of a recap. For some of you, you might learn something new as well. So it's probably no news to you that the way we produce and consume food is highly unsustainable. 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been exceeded. A third of food grown and produced is wasted. Diet-related illness, such as obesity and heart disease, is a leading cause of death globally. And according to the recent Living Planet reports by WWF, nearly 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, mainly due to deforestation and overfishing. So the food system also contributes to about a third of greenhouse gases, which is quite shocking. So the trajectory for keeping global warming below 1.5 degree rise, as per the Paris Agreement, is not looking good unless we dramatically reduce carbon emissions, and that is starting now. So next year, 2021, should hopefully be better than 2020 for us all, although the food has enjoyed a bit of a pause. The Food System Summit in New York is taking place, the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, and the Biodiversity Conference in China are taking place. So these are really big events, really important. So, and businesses and governments around the world must urgently decide on what decisions to make and what direction the food system should take. And they also need to have the information required to make these decisions. So there's real hope that in light of these events, the business leaders around the world will learn a little bit more about the food and the change that is really needed. So the role of the food industry. So the food industry has a vital role to play in ensuring the food system provides healthy and nutritious food that is produced within planetary limits and for current and future generations. And in order to make these informed decisions, business leaders will be required to understand how the food system operates and use the latest insights, research, and science to help nature and society on the path to recovery. So the food system has a really big role to play, whether that is large or small businesses. The food system is quite a complex system that we can have a food system and then smaller food systems with the food system, but it's essentially encompasses everything it takes to process, export, promote, cook, consume, and dispose of food. It's, as you can see, is an interconnected flow of actions and services, trade, policies, and power relationships. The key system include farmers and fishermen, consumers and citizens like ourselves, food companies, food service businesses, food retail, governments, and civil society groups. And there are elements the food system, including economics, politics, the environment, health, and society. And effective solutions to current and future food problems can only be possible if the food system is considered from a holistic perspective involving all these actors and sectors and players. And as one of the largest economic sectors, the food industry does play an important part in influencing. So food companies and restaurants and retailers actively shape and drive consumer choices as well through new product development, marketing, and promotions. So I've already mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals and the planetary boundaries. These are there to help governments and businesses on what issues are the most urgent and what environmental and social impacts are of concern. The SDGs on your left is a well-established scientific framework to help governments and businesses focus their sustainability efforts in an interconnected way in order to make our planet habitable for future generations. 193 countries around the world have agreed to actively work towards achieving these targets by 2030, so in 10 years' time. And food is a common thread for all these 17 goals, given that the interconnected economic, social, and environmental dimension that we saw in the previous infographic. However, some goals specifically related to food and agriculture, I would say, are number 2, number 3, number 5, and then 13, 14, 15, just to sort of pick out. And the planetary boundaries framework on your right is based on scientific evidence that human action since the Industrial Revolution have become the main driver of global environment. So this was developed in 2009 by Stockholm Resilience Center, and this focuses on 9 boundaries or limits that we should stay within in order to make a planet livable. So 4 of these boundaries have already been crossed, that we've exceeded these planetary boundaries. They are biodiversity loss, deforestation and land use, climate change, and the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, which are related to fertilizers and soil health. So there is clearly a high risk of irreversible environmental damage that requires, as I've said before, really urgent action. And the way we produce and consume food is currently a really big part of this problem. And it's also worth mentioning that we are far beyond just wanting to maintain ecosystems at the current state, which is often refers to sort of maintaining where we are. And we need to restore and regenerate in order to not exceed more of these planetary boundaries, and then also urgently repair the planetary boundaries we have already crossed. So there is a lot of work to do. And it's worth mentioning that, yes, the SDGs is both social and environmental impacts, and the planetary boundaries is mostly environmental impacts. So what is it that we have to do, all of us, consumers, citizens, governments, businesses? There's a long list of issues. So it's clear that all forms of food production generate environmental and social impacts. The intensity of these impacts varies depending on the systems of production. The key issues and actions for the food industry to urgently focus on improve the food system include some of these lists, including climate change, deforestation, biodiversity, soil health, fishing and aquaculture, antimicrobial resistance, food loss and waste, food justice and equality, very important, and unsustainable diets. And I'm sure we all know why I put a bee picture there to illustrate this, that we all need to work together, but also bees are sort of part of that biodiversity loss that is so threatening to our food system. So that was my little introduction. So this is what we all have to work towards, as I said, as consumers and citizens and governments and businesses. And I just like to finish this little introduction with saying that it's important to clarify that as my work as a consultant, I have to wear a different hat that I wear as a private person. So I would not be a good consultant if I would recommend these large companies to go down to the farmers market and get their produce, whilst privately that would be what I would do. And it's also important to remember that potentially all of us here on the call that are very invested in this topic are happy to spend a bit more money on quality and probably would not go to fast food restaurants as a personal choice, whereas that is not the case for the 7.5 billion people on the planet, which are not as privileged as us, perhaps, or not as sort of interested as we are in the food system, or doesn't have to sort of look at this from the bigger picture and really understand that there's a lot of people in the world that are part of this food system. So just want to leave you guys with a bit of a question that you can have your answer. So who do you know who the biggest food producers are in the world? Frida and Carla to sort of read out some of them, because I can't see my chat.
We will do that. Guys, if you want to post into the chat what your guesses are for who you think is feeding the world, basically. Okay, so Carla said, I think small scale farmers, question mark. Caro says Unilever, and also Mars, Nestle, all the farmers, the sum of small scale producers. Jana also says small farmers. Okay, any other guesses? That was it so far?
Yeah. Great.
I said really Nestle and Pepsi.
Yeah. Definitely, all these are, and so we have Nestle and Pepsi, probably number 1 and 2 in the world in terms of being the food producers and processors. Tyson, big meat company, Mars, Coca-Cola, Kraft Heinz recently had a merger. Before there were Kraft and Heinz, so that's a really good example of two big companies becoming absolutely massive when they join forces. Mondelez,
There's also
Danone.
Danone coming up. Danone?
Yeah,
How do you call this
Danone.
in English? Danone?
Danone, yes.
Mhm.
General Mills, Kellogg's were kind of on the top sort of 20 list kind of thing.
The question of Carla, I think, was also, are they really producers or just sellers? Like,
so listed as producers, that's because they work with farmers. You know, they are, you know, employing people to produce food for them in a very, very sort of complicated, long chain. But it is true that, you know, a lot of the small-scale farmers are who are producing a lot of the food in the world. So I think that's really is exactly why we have this conversation now, in terms of like who is driving the change in the food system and how can we make that better. So I think these small-scale farmers on their work for these big companies aren't setting the rules themselves. You know, they are probably not even owning the land they work on. And whilst there are, of course, small-scale farmers in their land and do decide where the practices are and what they are doing. And that's probably another webinar in itself. Yeah, thank you for your interesting contributions. So this is just outlines a little bit. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. The consolidation of the food system. So really shows how a few giants really own so many different brands, and how many brands there are, you know. And if you go into a supermarket, everything is packaged, everything has a brand on it. There's so much money spent on marketing and advertisement. And it is the world we live in, unfortunately, whether we like it or not. It's how most people go to the supermarket to get their produce. Most people are exposed to these marketing, campaigns, whether that is on their phones or on TV or radio or billboards. So yeah, so this is the sad world we live in currently, that we have to understand how these big companies operate in order to try to make some changes at scale. But then, of course, on the other hand, we also have sort of grassroots movement, and I just mentioned two international movements here, which are part of, they are made up of hundreds of organizations campaigning for small-scale farmers' rights to preserve food cultures, and which are really, really important. So, and I'm sure you know a lot of local movements as well. It'd be great to hear those as well. So these are, yeah, just two international ones that sort of are your. So there's real positivity in terms of management and the drive, and I think what I want to highlight is just the fact that we can't ignore these massive businesses, unfortunately, because that is how we live, but it doesn't mean that we should not campaign for what we. It's great to hear your thoughts on that. So I just want to sort of go. I do that. I think it's important to sort of just highlight some of the collaboration difficulties that I have experienced. And for small companies, it is difficult to understand the scale of this large, and even sort of work with logistics from a farm to a shop, or from a farm to a business. It is time consuming to do that yourself, and that would be expensive for you to do that yourself as a farmer. So you work with a third party, for instance, which means that a longer chain in terms of what you Can you all hear me? I feel like
Yeah, Ylva, can you maybe turn off your video for a second until the rest of the case studies, because I think your internet is a little bit overwhelmed.
I don't know how to turn it off when I share my screen.
Okay, you don't have
Can you turn it off for me?
Menu on the very bottom where you can mute yourself?
No, I need to stop sharing my screen if I need to do that.
All right, then let's try to continue like
again.
this. Now, yeah, now it works fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, certifications, often certifications such as organic, which can be expensive to get and also takes time. And then actually measuring and having metrics that you can show there's some quantitative facts about your business and how you work are also really important, but can be really difficult for a small business to achieve. So, you know, you often hear this, you know, it's word of mouth or handshake here and there, and that is sort of like not good enough when you start working with larger companies, because there's risks involved. And your large companies require standardized products and large volumes. They need specific specs of how, you know, big their chicken breasts or carrots are going to be, etc. And I think it's also interesting to reflect the size of different businesses. So obviously I worked with a lot of hospitality businesses and really, really large ones, but they are still a lot smaller than retail. So for instance, I can mention any, for instance, large chicken restaurants, for instance, are far too small to very much influenced by retailers, for instance, which might share these sheds with them. So without having these bigger players do their thing, the hospitality business can't really make too much change on their own. So again, really showing that we need to collaborate, we need to move in the same direction in order to make change happen. So let's try and move to the first case study. So I'm going to case studies quite quickly and to leave some time for discussion at the end. So we can come back to them if you have more questions. So the Chefs is a community of 700 chefs from 77 countries. They really drive progress against these issues that are related to the SDGs. And it's by the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, and they are really giving chefs a voice around the table and around these debates, which is super important and which should happen with farmers as well. And for farmers in particular around the world, you know, there's an issue in terms of travel, logistics, language translation services, etc. And I think like this is such a good example of how, you know, so many individuals from companies are coming together to really have a voice and say, this is what we need as, you know, makers of really delicious food. This is what we feel important. Another case study that I think is interesting is Tesco, a retailer, and WWF working together. So this is a 4-year partnership that they are now 2 years into. They are aiming to reduce the environmental off. And what they are focusing on are sort of key metrics, including 7 key areas such as climate change, deforestation, sustainable diets, sustainable agriculture, marine sustainability, food waste, and packaging. So we see quite a lot of those issues I already mentioned earlier. And important thing here is really that the key out of this is really focusing on not just making Tesco's a better company, but influencing the whole retailer industry, the whole retail sector. WWF have been very clear the fact that their partnership will fail if they only influence Tesco's. They really need to influence the full sector. So just using Tesco's as a case study and sort of seeing how this is done at scale. This is a sort of case study from my personal experience working with sustainability. So I worked very closely with all our group in chain restaurants who are essentially competitors on the high street. So you can think of all the high street brands that you can possibly think of. They were probably in the room. And over the course of 3 years, they really got to know each other quite well. And we were able to collaborate and, despite being competitors, really share best practice, share insights. And we would often also invite the smaller restaurant groups. We might have between 5 and 10 sites rather than sort of between 50 and 500 or more than that. And it was really, they found it really useful to hear what these smaller group restaurants were doing and testing and trying. And they were then sort of saying, so if it works for 5 restaurants, how do we scale this up to 500? I think it's a really way of collaboration as well, to really listen to each other. And it's also, I think the smaller restaurants also found it was really useful for them to really understand how the larger restaurants worked, to be able to sort of understand for themselves, like if they want to scale up, how does that work? And some of the topics we covered were, food waste, of course, so helping each other, putting systems in place. The work, it quickly costs a lot of for large restaurants. If it takes an extra, hour per day for a person to sort of look in the food waste bin across 2,000 sites, time, the average wage, I mean, that adds up to a lot of money that needs to be sort of signed off by someone. So there needs to be, the operations manager needs to really motivate the financial director in these companies in order to put something like this in place. Other things, reusable boxes, how to reuse packaging, innovations then. So they would invite smaller to sort of pitch about what they were doing, and they would then help them set up on their systems, which can be quite time consuming and expensive, in order to let them sort of join their supply chain. And using Future 50 Food report was really interesting. And I think that was a really good start to sort of realize what diversity actually meant to a large business. Controversial topic, which I'm sure you all have opinions about. So they are it's important to where the money comes from when brands scale up, and also when they must come from somewhere, and it's often sort of not questioned until there's a scandal. And yeah, I think there's potentially like there's no black and white, right or wrong really. Oatly could have come out with their response to the critique sooner rather than later. So if they would have said straight up, this is why we're doing it, it would have been a lot better, I think, than if they discussed it once they got heavily criticized by other people. So for those of you who don't know it, Blackstone is a big investment business, and they've also been involved with Donald Trump's donor, etc. So they're bad investors. I'm not sure if there are any sort of big good investors in the world either. And it offended a lot of people. Saw Oatly as the holy plant-based drink company, And but yeah, it's interesting to see that these collaborations can happen at very large level as well. And what Oatly's response was that they needed to scale up, as a sustainable business, needing to produce a better option for dairy, in their view, to a big audience. They need money to do so. They need to build factories, to invest in farmers, and they need to help a sort of company like Blackstone can be diverted to a good company like Oatly, and they can see the value in investing in good companies, then perhaps that is a good way of getting interest rather than just investing in unsustainable companies. So this is kind of like final slide, something a bit more gentle than Oatly and Blackstone. Regenerative agriculture, a good example of a small movement that has been around for years from indigenous peoples and cultures, and it's being sort of invested for, like Cargill, mills, etc. And we could question whether we think this is a good way of doing it, of investing in the system. Are these big companies appropriating what these indigenous people have practiced for thousands of years, or is it investing in better practices? There's an interesting paper from Rodale Institute and the Carbon Underground on lately. It's really interesting, and they stated that all carbon dioxide emissions could be sequestered through. Has been criticized because the data doesn't really support these claims, and I think it's important to realize that are already looking down on some of these sort of grassroots organizations on these sort of claims. So by overstating something, we're not doing ourselves any favors. Not doing themselves any favors. So it's important to really have peer data and to really look into the facts of what is possible and what is not possible. So this is my last slide, so I'd love to hear your apologies if the internet has been a bit dodgy. If you have any questions about anything that I've said that you couldn't hear, just pick that up again. So I just wondered, at the back of this, have you had any experience where you have to make a decision, potentially working for a company, when you have to work with an organization that perhaps didn't agree with your ethos, or have you yourself worked for a large company in the past or in the future, or are you working for large companies, and how do you feel about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Ylva. Oh, did she leave? Did she leave? Where is she? Okay, so Ylva just left the room. Great. There she is again. Okay, I would have started to juggle at one point. Ylva, can you hear us? Hello, hello. All right, but maybe we can continue the conversation. So I think what we at Die Gemeinschaft as an association and as someone, or as a project that is also, we always look for funding, and of course there's always the question of sponsorships, and there's always the question coming up, okay, who do you work with? And I have had a lot of discussions with farmers, but also chefs and people who do work in the food system that have very strong opinions sometimes on who to collaborate with. And so it would be interesting to hear from you guys. What's your standpoint on that? Like, is it really, do you work for a larger company, and do you work from within and say, okay, we need to continue also driving change in these larger companies? Have you worked with someone bigger? Or what is your opinion on it? In the sense of that, how do we really make change, and can we collaborate with those larger companies? Yeah, take it away and unmute if you want to add something to the conversation. I think Ylva is lost.
I should be here somewhere.
Okay,
I think.
here you are. Okay, here we go. Okay. Oh, I see you again. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry,
so
I was lost for a second. But yeah, I also love to think and what your directions are, if possible. There's no right or wrong answers, and I think this forum is really.
Jana also asked, how much is the argument of being too small, the wrong party to make an impact, an excuse in your perspective in the case of a large chicken restaurant, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's of course, it's not to say that there's nothing that can be done, and I think you can all influence each other. And yes, I think there should not be an excuse in not doing anything. Absolutely, I agree with that. It's also to realize that the reality of the impact of putting that into practice might take a lot longer than if they were sort of like the only people involved in that debate.
And Jonas said, I don't know, Jonas, maybe you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, hello.
Hey.
Yeah, so my thought is, I mean, we got to focus on something at one point, I think, and there's always like the discussion when you take money from bigger companies or investors, is it green money or is it not green money? But it's a different topic. It's like, do you want to fight capitalism, or do you want to get a thing solved that is like really right now the biggest topic, like climate change, or how we get to feed all the people on the planet? So I think if a bigger company or like a large investor can contribute to make like food sources more sustainable, I think it's okay. I mean, I was just reading today that, for example, Google is like working on their organic, like their CO2 footprint, and I didn't know that, but for them it's easier because they have a lot of money, so it's so much easier to get things done fast than when you're just working in small scale and just with your resource. I mean, we have a winery and we're just like working everything out of our own money that we generate, but it's so much harder than when you would just take like that extra money from someone. You could realize so much more in such a short time.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that's a really sensible way of looking at it. And but I think it can also be difficult to keep those sort of instant reflections and emotions out of it, which is why sometimes it's good to stop and think a little bit about how and why these investments are made.
Jonna also has something to add. Jonna, do you want to ask also directly, or like add to the conversation?
Hi, Frida. Sure, I could do that.
Do you want to say also who you are and what you do real quick? Sorry, I forgot about that, but that's always nice to have the background.
I'm Jonna. I work with Bosener Mühle, an organic grain processor. And I will also be in the next talk at 7:30 regarding a rye experiment of some Berlin bakers. So I didn't want to be involved too much.
I've heard about it.
Thanks. Good. So what I wanted to add to the Blackstone issue is that I think it is important, and it is in the current climate of money going towards sustainable companies. I think it is possible to get better sources for your investors than Blackstone, because they're likely not a silent investor, which means they have a say in strategic business decisions. So they will want to have, they will want to see some returns that have to grow and grow and grow. And if returns on their investment don't come because Oatly says, well, now we want to go organic, now we want to take this or that sustainable business decision, Blackstone might say, no, but we don't like the figures that result from that decision. You can't do that, or we will withdraw our money. So I think it is actually important if you have some strategic business goals that are completely at odds with the policy and direction of your investor, then I don't see that that is a relationship that can thrive in the long term.
Yes, I completely agree, and I think that's a really important point to make, that obviously we don't know the finer details of these agreements and these collaborations. And I think, I mean, another example is when Coca-Cola bought Innocent Smoothies, for instance, and how that changed what they did. And yeah, I think we have to hope that these companies are putting something in writing that sort of makes sure that they can continue with their ethos and continue to work as a sustainable company.
Also had some questions. Carla, you want to go ahead?
Yes. So I have two questions. One thing that came to my mind during your talk was in Germany, there was a lot of debates on some biodynamic brands or associations selling their products in discount supermarkets. So I'm talking about, for example, Demeter selling at Lidl and Bioland selling at another supermarket, or the other way around, I don't know. And there was a lot of critique on that because people said it's going to water down the purpose of these labels. And other people said it's actually a good thing because that way it becomes more accessible to people. And I was wondering if you have an opinion on that. Yeah, because I still don't really have one. So I was wondering what you think of that, of like, yes, very sustainable labels or biodynamic labels selling their products in discounters. Yeah, and my other question was more practical. It was
so sorry, my internet is a bit bad. So in my end, from what I heard, you want to know whether discounters selling these products that have sort of Demeter certifications, etc., if that's a sort of good or bad thing. And
yeah,
I think it's a good question. I think that you know, they're always in supermarkets, whether it's, you know, a discount supermarket or whatever, like it is never the supermarket that is generous enough to sort of have this discount. Like it would always affect the producer itself, or the sort of brand itself. So I think that is something to keep in mind. And but yeah, as I said before, you know, like we live in a world where we can't all afford the same things, and despite the fact that food is too cheap in general, a lot of people still struggle themselves. And I think it is a difficult question. It is potentially good that these sort of better products are available to consumers that shop in discounted supermarkets as well. but yeah, the sort of bottom line of who pays for that should be questioned, because it isn't supermarkets.
Yeah, I think it's also it's what we said about the specific deals. I think part of the deal was also that there was no price pressure that was going to be put on the producers. So yeah, I guess it depends on how you work it out specifically. And my other question was more practical. So what do I do as a member of a grassroots organization? What do I do when a big company approaches me for something? How do I make sure it's not going to be greenwashing? How do I make sure it's not instrumentalized?
You mean if a big company would sort of approach you in terms of marketing and advertisement, rather than sort of a collaboration with the Gemeinschaft, for instance? I think if you sort of take the sort of bigger picture in terms of how we are all approached by large companies constantly with claims of this is, and of course they only say the good things, like this is, we are now, you know, carbon neutral this, so we're working towards that, etc. And I think it is really difficult as a consumer sometimes, unless you want to spend time researching these companies' websites, critique of what they're saying, and looking at what sort of campaigning organizations are saying about it. And we've seen that with, I mean, I mentioned Tesco as a good example before of sort of trying to work towards a better food system with WWF, but then equally they were also in the papers lately in terms of deforestation of the Amazon. So that is sort of raises other questions, and you know, that is again another big topic, because the sort of deforestation there are essentially legal because the local laws make it legal, but that doesn't make it right, you know. So there's I think we have to take claims from large organizations with a pinch of salt, absolutely. And unfortunately, I think we have to be detectives ourselves, and it should not be that way. I think also we should also be proud of companies who are actually telling us about the good things that they do. And I think often companies do not want to talk about what they do because they are afraid of backlash. And I think the more they speak openly about what they do, the more they influence each other as well, because no one wants to fall behind. So if you're going to collaborate and share with others, you know, if you as a large company do something that can inspire others, I think that's a really good thing.
Are there any other comments or questions on this? Because I'm also wondering, Ylva, you have worked in with the European Commission, right? So you were really involved in food policy and that part of the food system, and then you worked in the Sustainable Restaurant Association that is made up of private sector, bigger companies in the hospitality world. So you really looked inside these very different sectors that work also very differently. So what is your private, your personal goal and hopes for the future? Because I'm always struggling sometimes, when I see, this is a big company that really has, when we talk about Patagonia, where we met, for example, they have such a huge footprint. And so I think they're what do you personally want to achieve in the future, and where are your hopes there? Do you rather want to work with the private sector, or do you really feel also politics is such a big topic? Or do you just say, everyone has to collaborate together?
I think everyone has to collaborate together, but I think everyone has to work towards the same goals in their own way. And we can't all work together in the same way. That will be impossible. But I think trying to understand each other and what we can do, I think is important. And I actually quite like, and I find it interesting to work with larger brands, because the impact you have is really big. Like, you might start at sort of a very basic sort of playing field, you know, and then you quite quickly get up to sort of reducing carbon or increasing biodiversity or having better sort of staff practices or things like that. And if you multiply these things with, you know, 2,000 sites, it has a massive impact. Or if you work with, you know, other large companies, you know, then it is fascinating how your opinion and how your knowledge can have impact at scale. But then on a personal note, you know, I love working with really small little companies as well, because there's so much enthusiasm and things happen so quickly. And, you know, for instance, I've done quite a lot of workshops, etc., with one small business and another business influencing each other. And that is also really great in seeing how change is made, potentially with sort of like meat reduction of menus and a chef-to-chef workshop, for instance, and really seeing these individuals learning from each other and being inspired by each other. So I think there's sort of different ends of the spectrum there. Like, I love personal relationships and influencing people and changing people's opinion, but also what the food system needs is change at scale. And there's also a need for consultants to influence there.
Is there an example that you have where you really felt like, wow, now when they make this step, then this will have a huge impact? Like, do you have an example from your work?
Yeah, I've worked with a large contract caterers company a few years ago. It was a sort of probably a year and a half, 2-year collaboration with them, where we really looked at the whole operations of what they did. So we worked with every single department, making sure that they understood what their goals were, ensuring that that aligned with the operational goals. So we did lots of sustainability training and workshops. And in the end, that really influenced everything from, you know, paying staff better, having better benefits for staff, reducing food waste, making sure that their sort of internal ordering systems didn't allow to order anything but food that were fair trade and organic, for instance. And, you know, really setting targets in place in terms of increasing, you know, free-range chickens, totally banning any fish rated 5, and sort of really setting a plan to work towards reducing fish rated 4 as well. And so that was really exciting in terms of a whole sort of systems change at their level, and really seeing the whole organization come together and work towards that, whether that was, you know, HR and legal department, the environment department, the sort of nutrition department, financial department, you know, they're all sort of working towards the same goal and really feeling part of this big change. And that was really exciting.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's been other sort of smaller companies as well that sort of have done equally well and sort of pushed for food systems change too. But it is nice when it takes longer time when you work for large companies.
Yeah. Looking at the time, if there's no further questions or comments, I would like to thank you, Ylva, first of all. Thanks for joining and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us. Yeah, I think that it's such a big conversation that needs to be held constantly. And I think what we are also trying to do at Die Gemeinschaft is to be really open and have everyone sitting at the table. And yeah, as you said, I think you just said a really, really nice sentence when you said, like, we need to build understanding between the different actors of the food system. I think that's exactly what we're trying to achieve as well. And especially also in agriculture, it's a big topic. So yeah, I think we need to continue having this conversation.